This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good. Well, welcome everyone from around the world and here in London. My name is Adam Crimble. I'm one of the conveners for the Digital History Seminar here at the IHR, and we are very happy tonight to have Melodee Beals, who is a lecturer of history at Loughborough University, and she is going to be telling us about one of her latest projects on 19th century newspapers, which she's called Boutique Big Data. So off to you, Melodee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Adam, and thanks to the conveners of the Digital History Seminar for their kind invitation to speak tonight, and to all of you here and those of you watching this 6 to 9 months in the future. Tonight, I'm going to be reflecting upon my current research project, my methodology, how it developed, and how hopefully it will develop in the future. Most importantly, I would like to make the case to all of you for collaboration between boutique, institutionally funded digital history projects, and how we can bring them together to form large-scale projects through our own individual researches. So, let me begin with a slight description of my historical problem and my research project. The genesis of the scissors and paste project, which is what I'm currently working on, was several years ago when I, with typical postgraduate indignation, found an error in a book I was reading. The error was quite small. The author had misattributed a single newspaper article to the Edinburgh Advertiser when in fact it had appeared originally in the Scotsman a week earlier. And I took this quite personally, that he had declared that the Edinburgh Advertiser felt a particular way about Australia, when in fact it was the opinion of the Scotsman, word for word. Now, in the end, it's not really his fault. The book was written several decades ago, and he was doing a project on the Edinburgh Advertiser, not on all perceptions of Australia in all Scottish newspapers. And although scissors and paste journalism is well known to periodical scholars, the idea that most newspaper articles that aren't local history, local news, are cut and pasted from other newspapers, this concept is recognized by periodical scholars. It's usually noticed by most historians who spend a lot of time with newspapers, but it's not really well researched. The actual mechanics of how it worked are largely a mystery. Now, we know what it looked like. We know that there was an editor or a specific reprint editor hunched over a desk, looking over various subscriptions, cutting out the best articles, putting them into his own copy. There are lots of anecdotes in other newspapers and in fiction and plays about reprint editors. There's even a case in Sweden where an editor is sent to prison for a libel case, and they won't let him have any sharp implements while he's in prison, and he says that it is cruel and unusual punishment to take scissors away from an editor. So this is a well-known concept, but how they chose the individual articles, how they made decisions about how much to include, how much to truncate, it's really just piecemeal work. So what I wanted to do was to look at scissors and paste journalism on the large scale, to figure out how it worked, where the networks of reprints were, and basically create, in my wildest dreams, a database of all reprints, so no historian working on a discrete project would ever misattribute a journal article again. So the problem, as I've noted here, is that the scale of reprinting in the age of reprinting, which is the 1820s to the 1840s, is absolutely immense. It is the vast majority of newspaper articles. So how do you go about finding which are reprints and which are not? Well, you could rely on the honesty of the editors, but attribution was incredibly inconsistent. Sometimes they say it's from the Times, usually they don't. And the problem with this is they're not being duplicitous. This was perfectly acceptable practice. It wasn't under any kind of copyright law, and everyone expected that you would copy and you would be copied. Some newspapers were actually quite flattered when they got picked up by bigger or more important newspapers. We also don't really have all of the network components. Newspapers that have survived to the present day, let alone been digitized, are very, very small. We don't have every issue of every newspaper, so we can't be sure what pathways they all took. And let's face it, historians only have, at best 90-year-old lifespans. We can't really hope to go through every single newspaper in the history of mankind and find all the reprints. So these were the different problems that I was facing when I was going for my goal of creating a reprint database. And so I came up with a quite complicated methodology on how I was going to go about this. And this is what I would like to talk to you about today. With the plethora of commercial, state, institutional, and personal digitization projects, there are people all over the world who are digitizing their own local newspapers. There must be something we can do to avoid misattribution and actually speak with confidence as to the origin of newspaper articles and actually the evolution and the pathways different versions of that article took. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I will take you through my attempt to disentangle the mysteries of 18th and 19th century reprint culture. And I'll move from the most basic forms of what I would call digital due diligence to a full integration of boutique and big data projects. And so for the first part of my paper, I will be talking about the first half of this flowchart, and I realize it kind of goes left to right, right to left, left to right. But how you work with the big data project and then how that scales down into close reading and institutionally funded or personal research projects. So the first step, of course, is to get some sort of transcription of the newspaper articles you want to trace attributions and reprints from. Now, one of the most profound crimes of the digital revolution was the creation of full-text searching in newspapers. Although arguably a godsend to academics who experience ever-shrinking travel budgets and those who just like doing research in their pajamas, it has created a number of problems. First and foremost is the misuse of the full-text search engine. When undertaking a project in cultural or social or economic history, it is very tempting to go to, for example, the Times or the British Library newspaper collection, type in the keywords of your research, and get that killer quotation that just sums up the mentality that you're trying to convey. And that is a very uncritical way of using not only newspaper material, but digitized newspaper material. And I think with looming deadlines, everyone's been tempted to maybe do a quick scan to see if they can find a funny title for their conference paper. But there are a lot of difficulties with this because it's really removing the newspapers from their material context, which digitization is already doing, but also that quotation's context in terms of how the readers at the time would have understood it in the wider conversation. Whether or not it was a reprint or reprinted later, whether or not it was referenced or alluded to, these matter when using particular quotations in your research. Now, this is not digitization's fault. I want to make that quite clear. This has been something that historians have long been guilty of, ever since there were indices to various newspapers, notably again the Times. If you are able to easily find a particular topic in a newspaper, it is the path of least resistance, and it's something that historians have done for a long time because of limited time resources, not because of any kind of nefarious purpose, I would say. But this causes quite a lot of problems even when reprints are recognized and acknowledged. Recently, Uriel Hyde's book, Reading Newspapers, had a wide selection of newspaper material from the American periodical press. Unfortunately, a closer examination of the footnotes reveals that almost all of it came from the Massachusetts, specifically the Worcester, Massachusetts press, and were reprints of newspapers from other parts of the states. So on the one hand, yes, it was a wide look at American culture, but on the other hand, it came from a very specific filter of the Massachusetts press. So the idea of reprinting is affecting our research and is not necessarily being fully teased out. There have been some efforts to really engage with reprint culture, most notably Bob Nicholson's You Kick the Bucket, We Do the Rest article, where he traces the origin and evolution of jokes in Victorian newspapers, where they began usually in the American press for his research, and how they developed as they were reprinted in other locations. But as Nicholson has noted, and many others have noticed, it's difficult to trace reprints. Now that we have full text searching for a lot of these newspapers, it would seem like basic due diligence to go and type in bits of that article to try and find other copies of it, see if it was printed earlier or later. But it's very difficult to actually find reprints in this manner. The optical character recognition that's used is not precise enough, and the article that you're looking at, you may say, this is the key phrase. Surely this phrase appears in all versions of this article. And really that may not be the case. So you can search for a long time and not find dozens of reprints that are actually there, just because it is a bit hit and miss. The other problem with this is that it leads to the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of personal repositories. How many historians across the world have notebooks, filing cabinets, laptops, and old hard drives filled with notes they have taken from periodicals over the years, in various forms of text documents, Excel documents, Word documents, WordPerfect that can no longer be read on some computers. And there they sit, maybe to be used by that historian again, but probably to lie neglected unless that historian's library is taken apart after their death. So these are not only databases that we have to deal with that are online, but the ones that we have digitized but can't access because they're on individual computers. So search and transcribe is the start to finding reprints. A very basic amount of due diligence. You find an article you're going to use in your research, you try to find out where it came from. But it causes as many problems as it solves. So depending on the size of your personal repository, it might actually be that an individual researcher has come across numerous reprints without even knowing it. It actually happened to me in the course of my PhD research. I had a laptop hard drive filled with partial and full newspaper article transcriptions, many of which were reprints that I had taken transcriptions of so far apart in time, I hadn't realized I was retyping the same article over again. So there are several ways that you can go about finding these reprints within a offline digital corpora. The way I think is probably most effective is the use of plagiarism detection software that allows you to find copies. Now, while you could use something like Turnitin, I don't think the Turnitin Corporation would really appreciate us filling up their databases with 18th and 19th century newspapers, although it certainly would make dissertations much more interesting getting red flagged all over the place. The most effective plagiarism software that I have found to date is something called CopyFind, or WCopyFind for the Windows version. It's created by this man, who is a physics professor at the University of Virginia named Lou Bloomfield, who is my personal hero and favorite person in the world for creating this program. It is a highly customizable search. It's open source, so if you want to make it even more customizable, you can actually open the program up and alter it. And it's completely free, so I really do love this program. And I'll tell you why I love it. First of all is that it works with both offline and online corpus. So you can put a directory of text files into it. You can also put in a list of website addresses, and it will search those web addresses against your text files. It was developed to study student plagiarism, but it's very useful in this way as well. The other reason I really think it's very, very helpful is that unlike most Ngram programs that look for 4 or 5 word chunks, it doesn't have to take out stop words or punctuation. You can choose. Do you want all those little grammatical words? Do you want all the punctuation? Do you want the numbers or the things it doesn't think are words? And that comes to play a really important part because a lot of reprints change the number two to the word two, or it will abbreviate things, it will add punctuation according to house style. Being able to be very precise with this helps you find more reprints. It also has a command line version, so you can have the nice graphical interface of Windows, or you can have the command line one, which is slightly more powerful and a lot faster, which I'll get to in a moment. So it works really well with very neatly organized corpora that you have on your own computer, your own text files. And when you run it through the computer, you get something very similar to this. You get a plain text version of this as well as an HTML version, and it is a table of your results. And as you can see behind me, hopefully, it indicates right and left perfect and overall matches. And although you can have it look for whole words, I usually set it to character by character analysis. So if somebody has changed the spelling of the word, changed the abbreviation, it still comes up very, very easily. So you can look and see how much of it is the same at the beginning of the article or the end, and help determine whether or not it is a positive match. And it takes into account errors and exclusions. So you can have it have a lot of fuzziness to it if you are working with imperfect transcriptions. The HTML version also links to a side-by-side comparison, which I'll go through in a bit more detail in a moment. But it lets you look at the two different versions of the article, highlighting what it thinks are the matches or the near matches. So you get a visual representation very, very quickly. This is very similar to the program Juxta, if anyone has ever used that. Although Juxta is really for using two things you know are the same. You're looking at different editions of a book, perhaps. This lets you go through hundreds of thousands, if not millions of records with that same level of comparison. And it can be used on the command line, as I said, because it can be huge files if you have a very large corpus. And probably the most important part about it, and the reason that it has made my research possible, is that it works really well with badly OCR or optical character recognized text. That is the key problem with a lot of reprint finding, is that the same word, the exact same phrase and sentence, could have been rendered completely differently depending on how the computer analyzed that text. And through the genius of Lou Bloomfield, this is really good at getting around these OCR errors. So what I have been able to do is, with the kind permission of the British Library, I have been able to access the OCR'd transcriptions of the 19th century British newspaper collection. And for anyone who has had the privilege of viewing the XML or the encoded version of these transcripts, they're really quite terrifying. Every single word has a three-dimensional coordinate around it so that it can be highlighted on screen with the image. That's great for highlighting images, but it's absolutely terrible for text mining. You get lots of extra code that you don't need. So the first thing I had to do was to remove all of that through XSLT, so that it was just plain text documents of just the raw text of the articles of the newspapers themselves. This really put all the metadata into the title of the file. So if you saw here, London Courier, January 2nd, very, very simple metadata, but that's all I needed to be able to find that article again. So once I've run this new giant corpus of OCR text through the program, I get a very similar readout as I had before. Now this is the results I had when I ran the year 1820, which had 8 different newspaper titles in the collection, many of them daily, some of them weekly newspapers. A lot of pages of newspapers. It actually took 3 days the first time just to do that first year. I've since found ways to speed it up. The text files used represent whole pages of periodical text as opposed to individual articles. So the percentages that you see here are actually quite low compared to when I was doing my article repository, but 5% of a whole page is still a hefty bit of text. Files are all labeled by the date and page number so I can find them again. And the way it's tested is every individual page of the collection is tested against every other page of the collection, regardless if it's the same newspaper or the same issue. And this gave me a really robust, everything in the collection had been tested. Windows copy find takes about 30 hours to do a single year. The command line version took about 4 hours. So if you can learn the command line, it makes a huge difference to your electricity bill. There were many false positives because I was quite liberal in what I told it considered a match. But it's unclear how many false negatives there were. Again, without going through every single page of the corpus, I haven't found any from my case studies where it's missed very many, but there have been a few. And I'll explain why in a moment. So if you look at the sample side-by-side comparison, and I do apologize profusely if anyone in here has red-green color blindness, the green is in italics and the red is just underlined, so I hope that helps a little bit. If you look at this side-by-side comparison, you can see how forgiving Bloomfield's software actually is of OCR errors. There are words that are clearly not words on one side, a series of random letters on the other, and they are in fact a match. When I went back and looked at the original images of these two articles, they came out perfectly. Now this is a pretty human readable one. There were some where it was just a string of characters. I had no idea that they were truly a match, and it was. So it's very forgiving of patterns that the OCR makes out of what should be letters. I can tell you that there are a couple of places where this can be detrimental, and that is in tables. So a lot of newspapers that have any kind of actuarial or wage tables, this, a million comes up a lot of times, and that'll cause a lot of false positives, unfortunately. But for plain text, it seems to work really well. All of this is hyperlinked, so if there are several matches on a single page, you can click on the one match on one side and it'll scroll to that bit on the other page. If they've reorganized the paragraphs, which sometimes they do, naughty editors that they are, it'll help you figure out which order the paragraphs eventually ended up in. So the question is that I threw this corpus into my plagiarism detection software. I received 200,000 matches for 1 year. How important is the human in all this? Can I go through every match? Can I refine my testing parameters? Is this just something fun to do and say, look, I made pretty colors? What is the human element in this big data project? Well, I don't know fully yet, but I can say that there are some things where the human element is quite small, things that you can do directly with the data that you retrieve. Unfortunately, the thing you have to do before you can retrieve that data is you have to decide how much of it you want to actually put into your visualization. 200,000 hits clearly has too many false positives. Reprinting is rampant in the 19th century, but it's not quite that rampant. So you have to decide how to make it likely candidates as opposed to just raw matches. Now you could just lower the parameters on the search in the plagiarism tool, but I found that takes out a lot of the OCR fuzziness. So I actually developed different rules that seem to work a little bit better. Through 3 separate test runs of 1800, 1810, and 1820, just to give a fair run of this larger sample, I put in simple filtering rules, and it was a lot of trial and error to see if I cut out too many true matches. The first thing I did is I removed any internal reprints. So if something was from the same newspaper, I took it out. In all the research I've done, I've only found one newspaper who was absent-minded enough to actually reprint its own article twice, by mistake, and as opposed to greatest hits. So I removed all the internal reprints. This also got rid of a lot of advertising, ads that would keep running over and over again. I restricted the match size to 90 characters right, 90 characters left, or 160 overall. So it had to have most of the same article from one direction or the other, or bits and pieces around 90 and 90. This was heavily trial and error. I started off with about 400 and I missed a lot of articles. I went down to like 50 and I got a lot of nonsense. 90, 90, and 160 seem to have the best ratio. I also had to restrict the date separation. If two articles were more than 200 days apart, I've yet to find an article that was actually reprinted in the newspaper press. Magazines could take years to show up again, but within newspapers, they generally did it within 200 days. After that, every match I found was an advertisement or just a mismatch. Again, trial and error, but it seems to work pretty well. So once I put these rules in place, tested them over several different year groups to make sure it was consistently meeting my expectations, it took it down to about 10%, or about 22,000 hits, which is still a huge number for an individual person to go through, but is more manageable and probably more representative. And once you have that, you can do some statistical analysis. Now, I want to make it really clear to you that these are drawings, not graphs. I make that proviso because although I've used, to the best of my ability, sound statistical models, I had to make some adjustments to make it visually understandable. And therefore, if you were to try to do proper social network analysis statistics on these, you would have some anomalies. That being said, I will try to explain my graphs a little bit for you. So what this represents is the network within the British newspaper 19th century library collection. These are all the titles that appear between 1810 and 1817. If you notice, Liverpool Mercury is not connected in the first one because it doesn't start until 1811. What the closeness in 1810 represents is how strong the connection is. So two titles or two nodes that are physical proximity to each other share a lot of the same content. They have lots of matches. I kept that physical proximity throughout the rest of the decade, and I just changed the width of the edges, the width of the lines, to demonstrate the number of matches in later years, so that the nodes weren't jumping around the whole screen. You get sort of a constant image. And what this really tells me is that there are certain periodicals, Oxford Journal, Leeds, Ipswich Journal, Hull Packet, that have a huge amount of shared content. And as the decade went on, that content became much more evenly distributed, and then towards the end of the period became more concentrated again. And as you can see, that is the Napoleonic War. So there is a reason, probably, that the content became less local and more distributed. The other thing that's important to note about these diagrams is it does not exclude advertising. Advertising, which I'll speak about in a moment, does throw up some anomalies, but it is interesting, and the networks that it forms are interesting in their own right. So I wouldn't want to exclude them, maybe separate them into two different charts in the future. But it does give you a general idea of how these networks evolve over time. And hopefully, when I have the entire century done, it'll give a much clearer idea of how networks change with new titles and new technology. So what these network diagrams illustrate, or what they obscure, is the fact that digitization projects have nothing to do with how these networks actually functioned in the 19th century. I can make network diagrams all day long for the rest of my life, And I'm limited by the fact that these are the newspapers that happen to be in this particular collection. They were chosen to be representative, not necessarily to be connected to each other. So it's actually amazing that there are so many connections between these journals that are chosen to be a wide berth of society. So how do you go about fixing that problem? How do you go about putting those missing nodes back into your diagram once you've run this kind of analysis? Well, all the periodicals that are digitized and made machine readable, you could theoretically add them together into one giant corpus and run them together. You would probably need a supercomputer, or at least technology to move on a bit more than it has on the personal computer. But it is possible. Unfortunately, they're held by different commercial, state, and as I said, personal repositories. But these are not insurmountable problems. These are problems that can be changed in the future. One way to really go through this is to take what we get from the individual corpus analysis and to manually curate those missing nodes. To go to other providers and look for those different articles. And this is either by doing search and transcribe, as I described beforehand, or by going through physical hard copies of non-digitized newspapers for around those dates looking for those articles. This is a tedious process, but it is one of the best ways we know of for getting a complete pathway of a particular article. There are some pitfalls also moving between national repositories. As I'll talk about in a moment, I was looking for an article about a very specific death by laudanum, a suicide. And when I searched for it in the American database for the correct dates, I had a different highly publicized suicide by laudanum, but not the one I needed. So there were difficulties when doing national or colonial or international news. How do you make these search terms really find what you want and not just a similar story using the same keywords? The other problem with comparing databases that I hope will someday be solved is the difficulty with translation. So much of the reprinted content was taken from or to French-speaking periodicals especially, that having some sort of translation plagiarism detection software is eagerly awaited by scholars of all centuries. It gets mentioned at every conference I've got to, this mystical plagiarism detection. But maybe someday when Google Translate is a little bit better and these plagiarism detection softwares can actually find reprints in multiple languages. So, you have seen what I've attempted to do by looking through these individual text files, creating these large-scale network diagrams. And what I have decided is that advertisements are a much bigger problem than I originally anticipated. The age of reprinting was also the age of the penny press. So most of the newspapers that engaged in heavy reprinting also engaged in heavy advertising to keep their doors open. Front page, back page, hidden baked articles that were testimonials inside the middle pages. This is how they paid their operating costs, and it makes our work that much more difficult. Looking at page level matches is really helpful because often newspapers stole several things from one page. It helps find matches, but it makes it hard to take the advertisements out. A lot of commercial providers tag individual articles as being advertisements, but not all do, and they're not always catching those hidden testimonials in the middle of the newspaper. So because of the formulaic nature of commodity advertising, such as ship advertisements, you're also getting hits that are actually entirely different advertisements, but they used a stock letter to advertise their products. So this adds a lot of white noise. I would encourage anyone out there who really is into advertising history and brand history that this is a fertile ground to explore, and I'm very happy to share my data if you will help me take advertising out of my data. So that is my basic view of the big data side of my project, looking through these large corpora in order to find reprints despite OCR errors and despite differences in storage technology. So that brings us back to my methodology. Having unpacked the collections, analyzed them for reprints, made some lovely pictures, what else can we do with this? Well, that's when the real history begins, in my opinion. Not that big data isn't real history, but you have to have that second step. This is the point where there is a full reintegration of the case study into distant reading analysis. This is when the boutique in boutique big data really comes to the fore. By pulling out selected case studies, we can begin to understand those finer mechanics of the reprinting process that remain so elusive when we just have funny anecdotes about Swedish editors and their shears. So the one part of the reprinting process that seems particularly difficult to analyze from a big data perspective is directionality. Although we can find matches of individual articles, unless we go by raw dates, we can't really tell who is copying from whom. And that doesn't count for the various branches and evolution that an article might take. So hopefully by looking at case studies, we can start to pick up directionality hints and industry standards that will help us feed back into finer analysis of the big data later. So what I will talk to you about is how you work with the case study data and how you reintegrate that back into the large-scale analysis. So when I first began this project, I was terribly certain, as most recent postgraduates are, that I was the only person to have ever noticed my historical problem, or thought sufficiently about it to suggest a solution. With my introduction into the blogosphere and Twitter, I found out, like most recent postdocs, that nothing is new under the sun. Reprinting is, of course, well known. It's often discussed. Northeastern's viral text project had just recently begun and had lots of funding behind it. And there was a certain buzz in circles that dealt with reprinting about modeling possibilities. But the core question I wanted to answer still remained elusive, and that was directionality. Finding reprints, or memes in modern parlance, is pretty straightforward if you have the computer power to do so. Understanding the step-by-step evolution of news text is a different matter. Now this is a phylogenetic chart. It is a chart of evolution. This is the tree of life on the planet Earth. It's probably the best one I can show you. But the idea of branching off of text, the idea that a version has a slight change to it and that gets copied and changed slightly again, this is well known to literary scholars, and editions of novels and poems have this sort of treatment done. The question is, how do you do that with reprinted news material which has no attribution, no central repository of bibliographic data? So what we have to do is we have to look at successful traits, things that get passed on in different versions of articles, to try to sort of retro-engineer industry standards and cultural trends, and maybe that'll help us identify directionality on a larger scale in the future. So, the first article I did this for was something called Another Dreadful Massacre by the Natives of the Marquesas. I went through it in extreme detail in some other papers, which are all available on YouTube if you want to hear the story once again. But basically it was a rousing, ripping yarn in the South Pacific, and it was printed originally in the Sydney Gazette. It reappears in several London newspapers, and then later in the Scottish press over the course of about a week once it hits Britain. It always gets shorter as it gets reprinted, and they don't add a lot of commentary to it. The one thing that was really important about this particular pathway was the fact that there were three major types of changes. The first was the shortening. People in the provinces published less frequently, so they had less space than the dailies of London, so they often shortened the article down, which was quite lengthy in the original Sydney Gazette. Two, they're quite passive-aggressive about changing spelling or grammar errors. sometimes vocabulary. There were lots of different words used to refer to the individuals in the original Sydney Gazette, and it all got changed to Islanders by the time it got to Aberdeen. So there was a shortening of vocabulary. The third thing that changed was the headline. There was no headline in the Sydney Gazette, it was just part of a big block of text. When it got to London, it was called Another Dreadful Massacre by the natives of the Marquesas, except in one case, where it said British vessel plundered. And by the time it got to Aberdeen, another got dropped, so it was just dreadful massacre. What was interesting about it is that the British vessel plundered was the only accurate headline. There was no massacre anywhere in the article, but it died out. It was an unsuccessful trait for this article to have. So spelling mistakes are also unsuccessful traits. People tend to fix them as they reprint. So this gave me an idea of how this reprinting worked. So the next article that I did that I would like to show you is an affecting instance of self-murder. Sensational articles always will get reprinted slightly more frequently than run-of-the-mill articles. The Dreadful Massacre is a fun case study because the story was printed all over the Anglophone world for several years, popped up in literary digests 10 years later, little traits that have been picked up and lost. But even local news gives us a really good place for experimentation. In this particular article, it's only printed 3 times that I've been able to find. In the Morning Chronicle, the Flying Post, and the Examiner. And the Morning Chronicle gives a very lengthy account of the coroner's inquest, how she had had a very tumultuous and forbidden love affair. She had finally recovered from this and met a new man, but determined she couldn't live with him, that their marriage would be doomed, and therefore committed suicide in a female boarding house. Several doctors came to revive her, and she thwarted their efforts to save her. It's a very long and involved case. Has a similar news cycle as the Sydney Gazette. About a week, it pops up over the place and then dies down. So local or colonial, about a week is the news cycle. And the editorial choices made in the 3 papers are very, very different, even though they are essentially using the same official text in order to make their story. So, this case study was not part of a larger project. It was randomly chosen from my big data project. And once I found the 3 hits, this one was a match for this one, which was a match for the third one, which was again a match for the first one. I took really careful transcriptions of all 3. Space for space, punctuation mark for punctuation mark. And I reran those through CopyFind on their own, just to see what the difference between these 3 individual versions were. And these are the results. The top one just gives a raw comparison of the top 3. The Morning Chronicle is the original because it is the earliest date that I could find. Then came the Flying Post and then the Examiner. And by using the overall match, you are able to tell which ones are copying from which. So even though it goes 1, 2, 3 date-wise, you can tell by the character changes that actually both are copying directly from the Morning Post. It's easier to tell with the Dreadful Massacre story because there's 15 different versions and you can see quite big differences in the different copies. But it pans out here as well. When you look at the version that is in the Flying Post, I've given line-by-line, character-by-character description of the changes. And almost all the changes are punctuation. He's just applying house style, using semicolons instead of commas or vice versa, using capital letters for the headline instead of lowercase or sentence case. The only big difference is 6,900 characters are removed and 853 are added, and this is basically a summary. He has taken those 7,000 characters and made it about 10% of the size. But he's done actually a really good job. He's taken a bit from everywhere and summarized it in a nice and neat fashion. The same cannot be said for the Examiner. The Examiner makes all sorts of changes, capitalization, punctuation, and vocabulary changes. They both passively aggressively changed complete from EAT to ETE. Spelling mistakes never survive. But the major difference is they've taken out text from throughout the article, not in one big chunk. And what they've done is they've taken out all reference to the woman's alcoholism, to her history of mental illness, and to any connections that her mother had with mental illness. And basically they've left in the story of the mean man who broke her heart. And it makes for a much more pathetic and empathetic image of this woman. It's actually the one I read first. I had a very different picture of her after I read the Morning Chronicle version. So they have made very strong editorial choices using essentially the same text. They've not added any different words. They've just been very selective about how they cut it out. So we can tell by the raw character count and the dates that both copied from the Morning Chronicle. The Examiner has bits of the Morning Chronicle that the Post doesn't, even though it came later. But we can also say that while the Flying Post was cut for space, the Examiner was clearly editorialized. And this appears again and again in different case studies. Certain newspapers editorialize their reprints, other newspapers summarize for space. And they are very consistent. There is a house style for how you handle reprints. And this is going to be very helpful once I have a large enough collection of these industry standards to help us design search parameters in the future. So, in the end, since the project began, I've taken a dozen or so careful case studies like this, and the most important thing that's come to my attention is it's all a matter of scale. Case study searches are limited by time and access to relevant collections. They are augmented by clever search strings and human intuition. Maybe if I just phrase it this way, I'll find it this time. But they're also hindered by those human intuitions, taking you down maybe human biases. OCR reprint matching is limited by the OCR quality and the reprint matching resolution, whether you use whole articles, whole pages, or just engrams, individual statements. And the thing I've really found out, especially with the Marquesas article, is every single version I've done, every single resolution has picked up new articles. One method's not better than the other. They all pick up different types of articles at different stages. And that's why I would really make the case for bringing individual case studies back to big data. After I've made my OCR, my manual transcriptions of all of those different articles, I put them back into WCopyFind against the larger corpora. And I found more matches. So although it was very good at matching OCR to OCR, adding in that high quality resolution source material found even more matches. And what was really annoying about this particular match I found is it made me remap my entire map of the Marquesas story. As I said before, I thought there was this very clear pathway through London to Scotland. There was one article with a good headline that died out. And if you can sort of read on here, Preservation of Captain Fowler and his crew by an island chief. Another unsuccessful headline that speaks quite positively of the Marquesa natives. So my idea that there was one bad headline or one unsuccessful headline was wrong. There was actually another, and I only found it by using case study material back against the big data. So, boutique big data. My pitch for this paper, my hope for future research is simply this. If we take those individual case studies, those projects that we are all taking part in as we do our historical research, whether it's with periodicals very specifically or whether we simply use periodical material in our wider historical research, that work, that effort that you've gone through should not be lost. If we have some sort of shared transcription standards, whether that's text encoding initiative standards or something more historically focused that we come up together with, that allows us to collaborate and to share our data. Now, it does require a bit of collegiality. It does require the idea that you don't store it up until you die and then they can have it. But there are numerous benefits to doing so. Many of my favorite case studies have come about because people have given me bits of their data to play around with, and I've found new and interesting points. In the first instance, to help them with their research, but also to help mine. I also make all of my data available publicly, and it's been used in teaching and in research in other institutions. And they've done really interesting things with my data that I hadn't even thought about doing. So there are huge dividends to sharing this information. And most importantly, if you are working on an institutionally funded project, if you don't necessarily have the big AHRC grant, it doesn't mean you can't make that discovery that really changes how we look at big data and how we work with it in the future. So, this website is called scissorsandpaste.net. There's a little bit of an advert at the end of my paper. I do apologize for being so blunt about it. But basically, the transcriptions that I've produced in the course of my research, and all the metadata and all the reprint data that I've discovered thus far, is put up here in this sort of hopefully easily navigable website presence. It's also available in its raw data form at my GitHub, which stores not only the raw XML data filled with juicy metadata, but in lots of more usable forms, plain text or in Excel table format of various different aspects of the data. And my plea to those of you who are watching online 6 months from now or who are in the room today is to consider donating your newspaper transcriptions to my database or to making your data more available in the future. You don't know necessarily how your data might be used or what other people's data might contribute in a collaborative process. So if you are at all interested, I do have a selection of cards to remind you of the website addresses, and I would really love to talk to all of you about either my methodology and how it's worked out, or about collaborative projects between boutique individual projects. Thank you very much.